Folks, happy Friday and welcome to the Freedom from the Press podcast. My name is Jason Robertson. I'm here with my co-host.
And I'm Todd Peterson. Welcome from a rainy Minnesota. We wouldn't be Minnesotans without referencing the weather. Good to have you with us today. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, like who knew all of a sudden we have like 5 inches of rain. I just got my new concrete driveway poured last night or yesterday too, so timing's perfect for that.
How about that? You know, it's not as bad as New York though with the subways underwater.
Oh, isn't that crazy? Crazy weather. Must be global warming or something. Well, hey, folks, ton going on in the news. We got Biden impeachment. We got government shutdown. We got all kinds of things going on. Todd and I wanted to take a chance to talk about the elephant in the room nobody's talking about, which is our government currently has $33 trillion in debt. And counting. Actually, to be honest, we need to update the graphic. It's now $33.1 trillion in debt. And while that 0.1 doesn't sound like a big number, that's actually $100 billion, folks. $100 billion. Todd, before we get going, we need to give all of our listeners a little assignment. Take a guess off top of your head how many zeros $1 trillion is.
I've done the math already, so I'm going to let our viewers figure this out for a second. Visualize, write it down. What does $1 trillion mean to you? Let's start small, right? So just $1 trillion. Visualize that, write it out.
Oh, yeah. Put it on your phone, write it out. Okay, so 1,000 is 3 zeros. Million is 6 zeros. A billion is 9 zeros. A trillion is 12 zeros. Write that number down and visualize that because we owe 33 trillion of those. Todd, doesn't that just make you sick?
I can't even wrap my head around a trillion, really. Like, when do you have a trillion of anything, right? And now we have 33 trillion of that.
Right.
It's something that's almost incomprehensible. It doesn't seem like a real number. We're talking monopoly money at this point.
Oh, exactly. And we've talked about the federal debt. Oh, that doesn't even include Social Security, by the way, folks. Like this.
Yeah, don't worry about the unfunded liabilities. We did a podcast a couple weeks ago on Social Security. Again, freedom from the press. We're trying to get information out there that you're not going to hear about in the mainstream news. We actually have some headlines from mainstream news, how they portray this debt crisis. It's not like we're talking about. It's probably like you would expect here. So they take a more cozy approach to debt's not that bad. It's manageable. But we covered Social Security. When we talk about the debt, we're not even talking about things that the government owes down the road. So that's just going to add on as well.
Yeah, and really this episode, folks, we're going to try to break down, our mission at Freedom from the Press is how do we cut through the media narrative and show you how our government is corrupt and is taking America down a horrible path. And you see brave men like Matt Gaetz and some of his supporters in the House trying to rein in the spending and rein in some sanity. Near the end of the show, we're going to talk about the current budget crisis, but just put this in perspective. The fiscal year, if you've ever done a fiscal budget at work or that kind of thing, starts October 1st. So from October 1st to the following September, you do a budget. So we're finishing our fiscal 2023, starting fiscal 2024. Last year, the government collected $4.1 trillion in revenue. 4.1 trillion. That's a lot of money. The government spent $6 trillion. So just the initial budgeting was $2 trillion more than we take in a year. That's what we're projected to spend. That's not factoring in extra things they add on or different measures they pass, that kind of thing. And that's on top of our federal debt. So if you think of that in normal human terms, let's say you're making a good living. And let's say that you make $100,000 a year and you're going into next year and you're going to say, I'm going to spend $130,000 this year. And that's on top of having, $100,000 in credit card debt. It's just unsustainable. And if we don't stop this spending madness in Washington, we're going down a horrible path. And when we talk about existential threats, the left likes to talk about climate change or whatnot. This is the largest existential threat, I think, in the world right now. So, Todd, what are your thoughts? Where do we start when we start breaking down what does $33 trillion? How'd we get here? That sort of thing.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Jason, I'm going to take a chance on Facebook right now. When you talk about man-made crises, I think you nailed it. Debt is certainly much more of a man-made crisis than our weather phenomenons right now. And I think this is a great time to point out, too, this is not a Democrat problem. This is a swamp problem, Republicans included. We just had Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor the other day talking about how urgent it is to send billions more dollars to Ukraine. You have Republicans passing debt ceiling bills, even under leadership of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy this past April. And again, you hear a lot of Republicans coming up right now saying we need to avert a government shutdown. Make no mistake, no one in Washington is your friend. As we break away from the press, we're also trying to break away from our party affiliation. Yes, we're going to vote for Donald Trump under the Republican ticket, but this is a Republican problem as much as it is a Democrat problem.
And you bring up a couple points too, because as we go through some of these stats and numbers, people hopefully are as mad as we are. If you have any questions with what things mean, drop it in the comments. If you're watching us live, shoot us a note. We're on social media. Some people are watching this on Twitter, some are watching on YouTube. And our goal is to try to explain this to you in average human, normal people terms. Because, like they like to say government spending. It's not government spending. Government doesn't make any money. That's your spending. That's your money that's going in. This isn't federal debt, and we'll call it the debt of the United States. This is your debt. So Todd's got a great graphic. Todd, why don't you walk us through this?
So if you're watching live here, you've got this on a video screen. So right now we're showing the public debt of the United States from 1990 to 2022. When we talk about $33 trillion in debt, we're really talking about the past 20, maybe 30 years where this has just ballooned out of control here. And so it took how many hundreds of years to get a couple $1 trillion in debt, thanks to involvement overseas, thanks to your growing government bureaucracy and entitlement programs. Really under George W. Bush and then Obama, Trump certainly didn't do any favors with the debt problem. Certainly under Biden now, that's not going away, but it just skyrockets here. You go from $5 trillion in debt, which related to GDP, sure, you can talk about the percentage-wise. GDP has grown since then as well. But it really gets out of control here. So we jump from 5 trillion, all of a sudden you get to 30 trillion. And Jason, it's funny, every time you have a Republican in office, Democrats complain about how much spending is taking place. And as soon as Democrats get in office, same deal. They have no problem spending their money to win over voters.
Right. And that's an important concept for folks to understand too, and we'll talk about how the budgeting process worked that Matt Skate is fighting back against right now with the potential government shutdown. But everybody goes into Congress and every year we've only passed like 3 or 4 budgets in the last 30 years. So they aren't even doing their jobs, which is actually to go through each of these departments and how much they should be spending. And nobody wants to be the guy that says, we're going to cut this program, because someone somewhere is benefiting from that program, and politicians are just there for votes. So when you look at the ratcheting escape and on the graphic, from 90 to 2000, you're right around 5 trillion. From 2000 to 2022, we've crested $33 trillion. It's just beyond remarkable. And then
every time we come to this point here, they talk about the debt ceiling. And so the U.S. government is beholden to this rule. They can't eclipse a certain amount. But what happens every time we're going to hit it, every time we get near a government shutdown or we're approaching the debt ceiling, what do the politicians in Washington do? They offer to spend more of your money and they raise the debt ceiling there. And they pretend to put up a fight. Republicans will vote no against it sometimes, but it passes. It happened 3 times when Trump had a supermajority. He had the House, he had the Senate, and he had the White House. And we still saw the debt ceiling get raised 3 different times. And so, again, this is not just a Democrat problem here. This is a problem for all of us because it's your money they're spending.
Right. Well, and it's interesting you say. We had a great comment from Mary. Why is it the responsibility of us to pay to help other countries when the people in the U.S. are hurting? Mary, that's exactly the point. And thanks for weighing in. If you think in the past 20 some years, we've accumulated $20 trillion additional in debt every year, we overspend what we're taxed on. And I don't think a single American is going to say they pay too little taxes. And right now, we are literally putting on the government credit card money we're paying for somebody else. So when we talk about like Ukraine funding, I mean, we came out this week from 60 Minutes that we're actually paying for their police and fire departments and all kinds of other stuff. We're sending foreign aid to other countries. That would be like if you're standing there and you have no money and you see your neighbor's car broke down. You said, you know what? I'm going to put my neighbor's car repair on my credit card. I'm just such a great guy. I don't mind if I got to pay it down the road. I don't mind if I got to accrue a bunch of interest. I don't mind if he's got his own credit card, maybe that he can pay his own stuff with, but I'm going to do that. And no rational human would do that unless you're a far better person than me. But that's what we do all the time. So
And
that's
Jason, it's a great analogy, but it misses an important point. If you choose to help your neighbor out, that's your money you're spending. Let's not pretend that the politicians are magnanimous at all. They're not spending their own money on that neighbor's car. They're spending your money on the neighbor's car. That's like if I go next door, take someone else's credit card to then go pay for
right.
my neighbor there. It's not on me, but I certainly look good doing it.
Exactly. Great point. Yeah, because once again, there is no such thing as government money. It is your money that the government took from you.
Yeah, and Jason, just along the lines of winning votes over here. So, whenever we talk about needing to spend more money in the government, again, the government spending your money here, Pew came out with a poll recently that talked about how big should government be. And so, when we talk about the size of government, we can directly talk about how much government spends, right? Like the bigger it is, the more expensive it's going to be. If you lean left or you vote Democrat, you pretty much say you want a larger government, which means you're okay with spending more money. It didn't really break down. It just did Republican Democrat on this poll here. So Republicans typically say they want smaller government providing fewer services. Democrats have no incentive right now to not spend money and to not spend more of your money because the polls show clearly that people want that to happen. They always say tax the rich, tax the corporations, not realizing, of course, that corporations are going to pass that tax right on to you. You have someone like Bernie Sanders who used to say we need to tax millionaires. He enters the millionaire status. Suddenly his rhetoric becomes billionaires. So it's very short-sighted if that's the way you're thinking about things. But again, there's a lot of incentive for this growth to continue because unfortunately, a lot of Americans think that they're getting something for free when the government expands.
Right. And it's funny too, because a lot of times you want to talk about like how much really is $33 trillion. So take a second, folks, and think how many American citizens there are. We're not talking illegals or non-citizens. Todd, what's your guess? How much is each citizen's share of that $33 trillion?
They used to talk about in terms of $50,000 not that long ago, but I'm guessing it's higher now, Jason.
As of this morning, $98,660. So if you are a U.S. citizen and you are watching this show, your amount that you owe, like they want to talk about student loans or debt forgiveness or that kind of stuff, you already owe, and you didn't even know it. You woke up this morning as a U.S. citizen and you owe $98,660. Congratulations.
And
You want
Jason,
to
I
make
have
it
two
even
young kids. When I was in the hospital last year, when my wife delivered our second child, little did that baby know that she was inheriting $100,000 worth of U.S. debt.
right. Now it gets even more fun. Let's say your kid gets to be 18, starts a little business, starts paying taxes. If you filter out just the taxpayer, so raise your hand if you're a U.S. taxpayer, which many of us are, and I bet many people watching are. If you just factor in the U.S. taxpayer share, take a guess how much that is, Todd.
I don't even want to think about that. So you figure what, maybe half, 60% of Americans are paying taxes right now. So let's double it. I'll say 200,000.
Close. Actually, there's fewer taxpayers than you'd think. Shocking. $255,353. So, folks, think of what you owe on your mortgage right now. Say, like, if you owe 250 grand on your mortgage, you probably have an okay house, especially if you've been in it for a little while. You owe $255,353 to the federal debt. Now, if you think about kind of what that translates to, Todd talked about gross domestic product. So that accounts for all financial activity in the United States. Right now, the 33 trillion in debt, not counting the 2 trillion they want to add. That's actually 122% of the national of gross domestic product. So if we took every dollar we produced in the United States and we shifted that money and just said we're just going to pay off the debt, we wouldn't be able to pay it off in a year. Think of that, folks. It's really crazy.
And Jason, the magic number that economists give, how accurate is this now that we're at over 100%? But they always said you want to have debt lower than 100% of GDP, as in you don't want to have more debt than your country's producing. But we're well beyond that, is what I'm hearing you say.
Right. And that's what's truly remarkable is that how is this not front page news? How is this not holy cow, especially with all this talk about government shutdown and and spending bills. And every time you turn around, the government wants to throw money at some other group. And then think about, too, as it relates to the illegal immigrant problem, all these folks are coming into America and they're adding to that debt without adding to that tax base. And all of a sudden, the numbers become even more astronomical. It's funny. I was doing some research for today's episode, and we're going to talk about interest on the debt and who owns it and how that works. Todd will do a breakdown in a sec, but just to kind of frame it up. So last year, Todd's got the chart up. Well, I'll let you walk through the chart, Todd.
Yeah, let's take a look. So this chart's not getting much better. So we had the timeline before of the debt chart. So let's go back to that just for a brief recap here. So again, we started at 5 trillion in 1990. We've ballooned all the way up to 33 trillion and counting here. Along the way, when you have debt, you owe interest on that debt. So again, you have a mortgage. When you pay your monthly amount to the bank or the lender or whoever it is, remember, you're only sending a fraction of that money to the principal. The rest is going right to the pocket of the banks. The same thing happens with U.S. debt. And so right now, if you're looking at the far right side of the chart, this is current as of 2022 at least. So again, it's going to be higher at this point now. Over $700 billion going just to interest payments right now. That's the interest expense on the debt held by, well, the government, but really you and I, as Jason and I have pointed out. Again, this is our debt, collective debt here as U.S. citizens, U.S. taxpayers. It is out of control, just what we owe on the debt when we're not even making payments to the principal of that debt. Pretty remarkable, because at some point, those interest payments alone are going to eclipse what the government can even afford, let alone reducing the size of that debt.
Well, and it's fascinating. As I was doing some research for the episode, we spend $100 billion more on our interest payments than we do for all veterans programs combined. So think of that. You have all these brave men and women who've gone to serve, defend America. Some paid the ultimate sacrifice. People came back injured, damaged, and we're going to pay $100 billion more this year on just paying interest on our credit card than we're going to those great Americans who served our country. And Danny, thanks for weighing in. It's great to talk about it. What, when, and where do we fix it? We're going to talk about some solutions at the end. And I got to tell you what, if you aren't following what's happening in the House right now with these appropriation bills, you need to follow. You need to reach out to your Congress people. You need to send Matt Gaetz a note, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Andy Biggs and some of those folks talking about getting some financial sanity back. And you need to encourage them to fight this fight, because we're about to approve our annual budget, which we'll get to in a little bit. Another terrifying fact of the debt, Todd, is who owns our debt.
So, Jason, you and I have the preview here. I want to give our viewers a second to maybe think about this as well. So, where is this debt coming? Someone has to buy the debt. So, when we take out a loan, again, who is that bank for the U.S. government in a sense here? So, this is pretty remarkable here. We have a couple graphics to pop up. The first one here talks about major foreign holders of U.S. debt, the U.S. securities from the Treasury here. I was surprised to learn, Jason, I'll admit, Japan is actually on the top of the list here.
Right.
When we talk about what country owns the most U.S. debt, oftentimes you hear China. China owns all of our debt, which is true. They're second on the list, so make no mistake, they own a large portion of that. But Japan is on the top. You have the United Kingdom. Luxembourg surprised me as well, right? The little tiny European country, which I think has the highest per capita, maybe. So the wealthy country, but again, a small little sliver in Europe there. They own a bunch of our debt. Belgium, Switzerland. So you can see Cayman Islands was interesting as well, because you always think of like shady deals, happening in the Caribbean on the Caymans. Our debt is owned by a lot of other countries overseas right now. And again, you think about foreign entanglements. What kind of leverage do these countries have, or some of these countries have, when it comes to, negotiating deals, whether those are economic deals, I'll say peace deals. But that makes it pretty fascinating.
Well, it's fascinating too to think about. So we give money to Japan, China, many of these countries on there. So we sell a bond, they buy a bond, so we owe them interest payments on that. And then we take that money that we borrowed, that they bought the bond for, and then we ship it to them and other countries. So if you're Japan and you're getting financial assistance from the United States, you are actually loaning us money to give back to you, and then we're going to pay you interest on top of it too. Like, isn't that great, Todd?
What a sweet deal.
Right.
So this one's fascinating. Let's bring it home here. So now this is more of a domestic thing. So we talked about how foreign countries own a large chunk of our debt. Where it gets really interesting is that the U.S. government, in essence, owns a lot of its own debt through some circular. It's going to be a death spiral at some point here. The Federal Reserve owns 20% of the debt. Now, technically, on paper, the Federal Reserve is not part of the U.S. government. I think you and I are smart enough, Jason, to realize that there's a lot of conversations that take place between the Federal Reserve, the politicians in Washington. There's certainly a nice little handshake agreement they have there. And then another 20% is owned by, again, explicit government agencies. Social Security, 10%. So when we talked about Social Security the other week, we talked about how they collect certain revenues. They go and invest that money here. It's a nice little deal that they have going. But they're buying up U.S. debt as well, as are, again, civil service retirement funds, the Department of Defense military retirement funds. They're investing in the U.S. They get a certain percentage back when they put that in. But you can see how it's all interconnected here. The government has debt. The government sells its debt to itself, basically, in some cases. And you just see this really, really weird connection here between the groups.
Yeah, and actually someday we'll have to do an episode on the Federal Reserve. It's funny, the Federal Reserve was passed in the early 1900s, one of the biggest scams ever, because the Federal Reserve, people think, is part of the federal government. And the government and the politicians are getting paid on the back end, make no mistake. But the Federal Reserve is a privately held bank. You could just interchange that name with Wells Fargo or US Bank, in which case people would be like, well, that's insane. Like, why are we giving Wells Fargo so much money? But they've smartly named it the Federal Reserve so that you think somehow it's part of the federal government. Maybe the US taxpayer is benefiting from that relationship, that sort of thing.
And Jason, sneak peek on the Federal Reserve show. Since its inception, your U.S. dollar purchasing power has decreased by 99%. We talk a lot about taxes on the show. You and I are going to write a big check to Uncle Sam next year. Inflation is certainly the hidden tax, and the Federal Reserve has done a fantastic job of inflating your dollar to near useless.
Well, yeah, and it's funny too. I'm going to steal this from Hutch Bailey Jr. He's a co-host on one of the podcasts we do. He said, when the Federal Reserve was started, if you had a gold bullion and you could buy 100 loaves of bread with it, today that ounce of gold bullion you could buy 100 loaves of bread with. But all of a sudden, the monetary value of that went from $10 to $1,500. But you still can't buy no more bread with it, folks. So that is the hidden cost of inflation. So, and one thing to touch on here too, and this is kind of going a little more deep dive on it. So I apologize if this becomes confusing for anybody, and I'll try to use layman's terms. We owe 33 trillion in our debt. 13 trillion of that matures in the next 24 months. That 13 trillion we are paying out an interest rate of between 0 and 1% because that debt was taken out in the extremely low interest rate periods. When we refinance that debt, depending on what interest rates are, everybody's seen how mortgages have gone up from 3-4% up to 7, 8, 9, 10%. We're going to be refinancing a third of the debt at probably 5, 6, 7% interest rates. So if you think back to the housing crash in 2008, one of the things that predicated that is people had variable rate mortgages. And all of a sudden their payment went from $1,000, their interest rate went up. And all of a sudden their payment was like $1,900 or $2,000. So a lot of these projections that we're talking about too are kind of related to, we have to refinance a third of this in the next couple of years. And if the interest rates stay insanely high, that is going to exponentially accelerate all this interest rates and payments and stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, 5% on $13 trillion. I don't want to do the math in my head because I think it'd be a little too depressing. So, Jason, if you think 33 trillion is bad, how bad is it going to get here? We have some projections to go over just that. Right now, we're at $33 trillion. And at this point, here are the politicians arguing over $2 trillion. Percentage-wise, they're like, well, 33 to 35, that doesn't even make a difference at this point. There are some projections. This is from the U.S. debt clock that Jason referenced earlier about how we owe $250,000 each as taxpayers on the debt. They're saying that by the end of the decade, if nothing changes, we're going to be up to $89 trillion. $89 trillion if nothing changes. And that even happens before, Jason, you referenced the increase in the rates of interest. This is assuming that no more government spending takes place, which we both know is certainly a lie. That's going to happen. They're going to keep spending more money. But if we thought 33 trillion was bad, what does 89 trillion dollars even mean to you in U.S. debt?
Right. And I mean, it's funny to think about. Hopefully, you're watching this, folks, and you're saying, wait a second, I'm a taxpayer. I'm an American citizen. I work my butt off. And I just rolled out of bed and I just learned that I have a $250,000 bill that I'm responsible for that I didn't even know about. How come my politicians aren't telling me this? How come they're on TV screaming about who else we're going to give money to or what other countries we're going to give money to? And they're not saying, hey, yo, Mr. and Mrs. US taxpayer, you owe 250 grand. Congratulations.
But I'm going to buy your vote because people still believe it. But Jason, you talk about why aren't we talking about this? Well, the media is talking about it. Here's how they headline some of their reports on this massive debt here. The first bullet point reads, the U.S.'s $32 trillion debt. This is from earlier this year. Debt mountain may not be as bad as it seems. Oh, no, maybe are you and I just screaming on a mountaintop, Jason? Maybe you and I are just pretending there's not an issue. It's not as bad as it seems.
Right. $33 trillion. That's no big deal.
But you know what? In perspective to $89 trillion, you're right. 32 may be not that bad because it can always get worse. And make no mistake, it's going to get worse.
Yeah, and it's fascinating too because I keep hearing about existential threats. I keep hearing about how what's the greatest threat to democracy this week? Is it global warming? Is it world war? Folks, we're staring at bankruptcy. If this was your personal balance sheet for your own finances, you wouldn't sleep at night. You'd be like, I am so beyond screwed. If you had a business that was running this poorly, you'd be out of business. You'd be locking the doors. So, Todd, we should give him two. Do you have that video to visualize what $1 trillion looks like? This
is a perfect time for this video. So this is about a minute and a half here. This helps us visualize what this debt just looks like.
Back 100. You'd be happy to have that in your pocket.
That truck going to Iran?
Exactly. That was the $2 billion trillion. This is a trillion. Look at that.
All right, if you're not following along here, if you're just listening on audio, we have the size of a 747 and now a football field with pallets of cash. And that's just $1 trillion.
It is the entire football.
About 10 World Trade Centers with pallets of $100 bills. So we're going to close the doors at $700.
Truly remarkable when you visualize it like that. For those who are just listening on the audio podcast, they stack pallets of $100 bills, and it's like 5 times the height of the Statue of Liberty, and then there's like 30 of these stacks. It's remarkable.
I'm speechless right now. That's so much money. And then, of course, what happens here is this money comes from somewhere. They're borrowing it. It's getting created out of thin air. That's going to lead to more inflation. And so, Jason, I know one of the questions came about what happens next. I mean, hyperinflation is certainly a conversation. At some point, money becomes so worthless that you're going to go out and spend it before it becomes worthless the next day, right? And so you talk about those spirals potentially happening here as it gets more and more out of control.
Right. And it's important that folks understand that too, because we've talked about on the show before about BRICS and some of that. How's the government able to pull off the scam? So we moved to a fiat currency when we passed the Federal Reserve, and kind of what that meant was if we printed a dollar bill, we had to have a dollar in gold. And When you go with the fiat currency, you have nothing backing the thing. So the dollar is just worth a fake amount. But we had structured it where we were the petrodollar. Todd, I'll let you explain what the petrodollar is.
Yeah, let me just finish that one more time. So the dollar is only valuable because the U.S. government says that it's valuable. I have some other graphics here when we talk about reserve currencies, reserve fiat currencies, in just a little bit here. I mean, spoiler, the timeline is not infinite. And so there is going to be an end to the music. There's not going to be enough chairs. But when we got off the gold standard under Nixon in the 70s, what happened was, like Jason said, there was no longer any backing. I couldn't go to the bank. I couldn't go anywhere and exchange my green bill for solid gold. All of a sudden, the gold standard goes away. Precious metals are no longer fixed to our economic situation here. And now I just have cash that's worth something because somebody said it's worth something. And that's going to change every day here. And so as we go down the list here, the government made their dollar stronger. They said it is worth something because you can exchange oil. And so that's the rise of the petrodollar, petroleum, when most of the countries in the world, or nearly all the countries in the world, would do business in the US dollar. So you think about how English is prevalent in the business world, same sort of thing. The US dollar is prevalent in the business world. And oil is so valuable, it hums every economy along. You have to have fossil fuels to make anything happen. And so you can exchange the US dollar for those fossil fuels. But again, Jason alluded to the BRICS conglomerate right now. You have a lot of powerful countries in the world saying, you know what, I'm not interested in exchanging US dollars anymore. Let's use another currency. We could go on some tangents about Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi over in Libya, how some of these so-called dictators, and I'm not going to get into the ruthlessness that they had, but they were both interested in gold-backed, oil-backed currencies, and they were a threat to the United States global power. And we know what happened to both Hussein and Gaddafi. They were taken out by the U.S. military. And you can't help but avoid the idea of that, was there something else going on that they threatened U.S. power?
Right. And the way I explain the petrodollar to folks is myself, Todd, probably a bunch of our listeners, you've gone to a casino and you've played blackjack. And you have to take your US dollar, you give it to the guy, and he gives you their currency, which are like poker chips. Yeah, I got one right here. So this currency is only good at that casino. You get to do all your transactions in it, and then you give this back to us at the end of your casino trip, and we give you back your currency, your US currency. Well, if all of the gold or all the oil transactions you have to use are casino chips, we kind of control the game, right? We kind of control what that is. But if I all of a sudden say you can use other casinos chips in our casino and you don't have to use ours to go play blackjack, all of a sudden, if yours is worth less, your casino's not running real well, people aren't going to hold on to your casino chips. And ultimately those casino chips are going to be worthless.
So let's talk about what that might mean in terms of casino chips here, Jason. So we've got a graphic pulled up right now. This is about the global reserve currencies in the last couple hundred years here. You can see that the US dollar is the reserve currency right now. It's been that way for several decades, stretching back 100 years. But again, I said it wasn't infinite. It certainly wasn't. Before the US dollar, the world predominantly did economic exchanges. You can see the British pound, the French franc, Spain when they were prominent in the 1600s. So different nations at different times throughout history have been the major economic force in the world. Jason, you and I are both very lucky to have grown up in America at a time when America had the global reserve currency. Between the debt, between the BRICS nations rising up, between more of a globalist interest and maybe consolidating power at the very top, you can see that there's not going to be a period of time where this is the case any longer. And that's what gets really frightening to think about. And our debt situation, as we relate it back to the conversation we're having here, certainly makes it worrisome because it is definitely related. As the debt becomes unsustainable, something else will replace the US dollar when that dollar becomes worthless.
And it brings up an interesting discussion too, which is kind of which came first, the chicken or the egg, which was the collapse of the empire what predicated a change in world reserve currency, or was a change in world reserve currency predicated on the collapse of the empire. Because if you look back at what the primary reserve currency was, that was always viewed as the most powerful nation in the world. And the United States for a couple hundred years has been viewed as that, especially in the last like 50 to 100 years. And that's where, if you look at our enemies that target us, if they can pull off BRICS, or when they pull off BRICS, that's going to be a huge financial hit to the United States. That slows everything down, folks. Talking about like, oh, we're worried about a government shutdown for a few weeks. We're talking about the U.S. might not be able to draw more on its credit card to pay for all these programs. I mean, it would be catastrophic to the United States.
Absolutely. And Jason, in the context of global empires here, where there's a correlation between military might and economic might, look, you and I both support boots on the ground, the U.S. veterans, people that bravely serve. The U.S. military industrial complex is a different conversation, however. And you think about military entanglements in the last several decades, at least, how much of that was a noble purpose and how much of that was defending the power of the U.S., economically, militarily. When you start to think back to different, let's say, theaters that the U.S. was involved in, was that out of pure nobility or were there economic interests involved? We can certainly look back to the debacle in the Middle East there. What was the real reason we went there? You talk about the oil fields over there. You talk about regime change over there. Was that to free people? Because it certainly doesn't seem like we freed a lot of civilians that got killed and harmed in the process of our involvement over there, but we did strengthen our petroleum usage and petroleum output while we were over there. And so when you talk about that empire building piece there, it kind of blackpills a lot of people. Yes, you can support the U.S. military when it comes to servicemen and women, but supporting the U.S. military, it starts to become a different conversation.
Yeah, and it's funny, one of the comments we like to say is always follow the money. And if the people that are encouraging us to take military action, like Lindsey Graham, guy's on TV right now, he wants to give more money than anything to country that shall not be named for Facebook purposes. And you say to yourself, why is that? Well, you guys know, you're not stupid. You know that when they give money to these, they pass a budget, hey, we need to buy more ammos, tanks, whatever. That money goes to these big military industrial complex companies like Raytheon and those sorts of things. Those companies funnel money back to senators like Senator Lindsey Graham in the form of campaign contributions. Remarkably, he gets hired to go give a speech. When he decides to leave the Senate, all of a sudden he turns up on their board of directors. And that's why your political leaders look the other way, because they're in on the scam, folks. They are in on the scam.
And I wish I had the graphic here, and I'm only going to make this an opinion, so fact checkers, there's the caveat there, but there's a graphic of, you have Joe Biden, but then you have people like Mitt Romney and some other Democrat and Republican senators who all allegedly have children on firms of companies based in Ukraine. So it certainly gets interesting when you talk about following the money there, because it's not just these politicians benefiting, it's their entire family and network of friends too.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because that's a big topic of the impeachment is, can you prove Joe Biden directly took the money? Guys, that's not how it works. The fact of the matter is, I have one son, two stepchildren that are phenomenal. If somebody came up and said, hey, I'm going to give your kid this high-paying job, can you talk about my company on your podcast? I'm totally going to do that 100% of the time. You know what I mean? And if you're a politician and they say, hey, we're going to hire your kids for these high-paying jobs, can you support this legislation? Of course, these politicians are going to do it. It's just common sense.
Yeah, that's how it works sometimes. So talking about the federal debt again, let's go back to the latest conversation here. So government shutdown September 30th, if nothing gets passed here. So we had some exchanges on C-SPAN here. So, Jason and I love to watch C-SPAN a little bit. And so we had Marjorie Taylor Greene going out there, as Democrats are railing against the GOP right now, saying, oh, they want to shut everything down. And let's not forget here, voters, especially Democrat voters, love big government. They want more government spending here. So that's how the Democrats are framing the conversation. Look at the GOP. They're trying to shut everything down, kill the economy. Marjorie Taylor Greene wasn't having any of it, though. As she tweets here, she says, Democrats are the party of shutdowns. They shut down our country for almost 2 years. And so this is her tweet here, and then we'll pull up the video file as well and just get to hear that exchange.
Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, Republican shutdown will cost 6,306 of her constituents their paychecks. In Lauren Boebert's district, Republicans shut down.
Democrats are the party of
9,000
shutdowns. You guys
Reclaiming my
love
time.
shutdowns.
Thank you very much.
Oh.
Truly insane.
And look, go for it, Jason.
I was going to say, so this is going to be the totally exciting part of the podcast where I'm going to give a little breakdown on what these guys are arguing about, what they're talking about. Okay. So I apologize if you're like, okay, this is kind of out there stuff, but let me explain how it's supposed to work. The House of Representatives passes 12 appropriation bills that are like their yearly budgets. They break the federal government down into 12 different programs: agriculture, military, a bunch of different buckets. They're supposed to review all the detailed spending in each of those buckets. Where does this money go? How much programs? If you figure right now we have a $6 trillion total budget. So you're talking like $600 billion in each of these buckets, kind of as an average. They're supposed to go through from the time they're elected until by October 1st. They're supposed to flush out these budgets, go through the programs, figure out, no different than if you've owned your budget. Like Todd and I have a business we're partners on. Every month we talk about our budget. How much are we going to spend this month? Should we spend it here? Should we spend it there? What other expenses should we have? That sort of thing. The federal government is supposed to do that. They're supposed to pass these 12 bills. Those bills then go out of committee. The House votes on them. Then they send them to the Senate. The Senate votes on them, and then they send them to the president to get signed. And this is your budget. This is where the money goes every year. Now, in the past 30 years, that annual budgeting has been done 4 times. 4 times we've passed a budget since the 90s. Now, if you coincide that with how rapidly our national debt and our overspend occurs, like if you look at that first chart and say, okay, we just quit doing annual budgeting every year for the, like, other than a few times for the past 30 years, all of a sudden it makes sense. Well, yeah, if you don't, like, if I didn't do a budget for myself or my family or for my business, of course my debt would go nuts. My spending would be insane, that sort of thing.
And if you knew you had $2 trillion extra dollars coming your way just with a vote in the House, right? Like, I know I'm going to get more money than I need, so why even bother budgeting? Because we'll just vote ourselves a raise.
Right. And now you're hearing some terms too, and just to explain what those terms are, when you hear the term continuing resolution, what that means is that you take last year's budget. Keep in mind, we're spending 30% more money than we're taking in, and you just continue that budget forward. So that says, I, as a member of the House of Representatives, are not going to do my job. I'm on this committee for ag. I'm not going to go through the ag budget and figure out where the money's going. I'm just going to pencil whip it. And I'm going to say, you know what, we're just going to take last year plus add whatever percent increase they do. Because you always hear that it's a continuing resolution with a 3% increase. That means we literally take dollar for dollar last year's budget, and we just tack on 3% to every single program. We don't cut a single thing out of it. We don't even go through it. And that spending just continues on to the next month. Same thing you'll hear with the extension one. I forget the term they're using now, but that's just a 30-day version of that. So all of this stuff, when they're talking about these budgets and continuing resolutions, is just Congress not doing their job. The other term you'll hear is omnibus or minibus. Todd, what comes to mind when you hear the word omnibus?
Omni sounds like it's a prefix for everything. So when I talk about an omnibus bill, it's like an Oprah show, right? Money for you, money for you. We're just going to spend it, and maybe we pass it and read what's in it later, right? To quote Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah. So what an omnibus bill is an omnibus bill says, instead of each of these 12 committees passing their budget for their respective areas, the ag committee or whatnot, they take all those bills, they throw it in a bucket. Usually it's like 50,000 pages. We should have pulled up the picture, but they'll wheel them into Congress. It's like you dang near need a forklift to bring the thing in. And it's essentially just an extension of what the previous spending was, kind of like a continuing resolution, where they don't really cut anything. Maybe they make a couple sacrificial cuts just to talk about. And then, but here's where it gets great with an omnibus bill. They get to add stuff to it too. So they'll make a few like symbolic, oh, we cut this, we cut that, but then they throw in extra stuff that's on top of the budget. And then generally speaking, these come out about 24 hours before they need to vote on them if they're lucky. So there wouldn't even be a possible way. But that's how they also pass some really horrible legislation. So in the omnibus bill that passed last year, right before the new House took over, they snuck in a change to the Electoral College in the omnibus bill. And a person might think, why are they doing the change to the Electoral College when this is a budgetary process? That makes zero sense. But that's where they pass some of their most nefarious laws, is they just package it in with part of the budgeting.
All right, Jason, I'm going to bring back Danny's question here. So he says, it's great to talk about what, when, and where do we fix it. So right now we're looking for solutions. So Jason, do you have any solutions to this $33 trillion debt?
Well, yeah. So the first thing, folks, if you think about, and I'm going to talk about one of my friends, one of my buddies, Jim. He listens to the podcast, won't give his last name out. When we started working together, he had some money problems. And I said, step one, let's start with looking at your budget and looking at what you're spending, what you can cut and what you can't cut. So what Matt Gaetz is fighting for, when you hear the term single subject spending bill, what that means is the Department of Ag actually looks at their bucket. They're one of those 12 buckets that I talked about. They come up with their budget. They go through it line by line, figure out, is this program right? Is this program wrong? Should we cut it? Should we keep it? Is there anything else? Do we need to increase spending or decrease spending? And that's what he's fighting for. Now, there's other initiatives too that he's looping in there, like we need to close the border, we need to do some of those sorts of things. And they use the leverage of the budgeting to try to accomplish some political goals. But at its core, what the Freedom Caucus and Matt Gaetz and those guys are fighting for is, how do we get these departments to actually make their budget? Once they set their budget, then it should be voted on by the House and Senate. And I was just reading this morning, and I don't know if it's true, but it sounds like 7 of those budgets are done with agreements that people have in place, that I think is pretty remarkable.
That's fantastic. And Jason, I'm going to go a step further here. So Vivek Ramaswamy, one of the GOP presidential job candidates, as Donald Trump called him, has proposed just gutting these departments entirely. So, you know what, Department of Education, instead of haggling over money or figuring out your budget, you're just gone. The entire department is gone. And we're just going to solve our spending problem that way, too. I think that's a viable solution moving forward, too.
Well, yeah, because if you think about it, you know, once again, if you're a business and let's say you had multiple departments, your least efficient department wouldn't want to give money to. If you look at the federal government and how inefficient it is, they're the last person I'd want to give money to. They, like, name one government agency that has benefited, or that you can look at and go, God, that thing's run really good. Like, that's much better than we can do in the private sector.
Yeah,
So
think about the debt that we've accrued since 1990. Is your life any different? Is it better? Is it more meaningful because the government tacked on $28 trillion? I'd be hard pressed to look around and say, yep, life is $28 trillion better since 1990.
right. Now let's talk about things that so step one, let's cut spending. Let's eliminate some of these programs. Why, Todd, why does no politician want to do that?
Gosh, if I say that I'm going to take your welfare check away from you or reduce the size, I might lose your vote, and the media is going to portray me in a negative light, and that hurts my reelection chances. So I'm not going to touch it. But on the flip side, if I promise you more money in that welfare check, well, guess what? I just earned the good graces of the New York Times and a couple voters that probably would have voted for me anyways, but at least it sounds good. Now I have some street cred because, you know, the liberal media likes me.
Right. Now we're going to take it a step further too, because we can all visualize that person milking the system, that's saying, hey, we're going to, you're just sitting there collecting free government money. But let me talk about something that was in the news. President Trump this week, he went to visit auto workers in Detroit. Most people don't understand what's happened in Detroit. 10 years ago, I can't remember exactly when, we had to bail out the automakers because things were rough. It was right after the financial crash. And auto workers, I lived in Detroit for a while, hardworking, amazing people doing God's work. Like those guys earn every cent they keep. But how did this current auto crisis happen? Todd, what would your guess be for the root cause of this auto crisis?
Usually you can pinpoint government as the problem. So, Jason, you talked about how government got their hands in the cookie jar. They send hundreds of billions of dollars to the auto workers, the companies, after the financial situation there in 2008. And then here we are today, right? Did
Yeah, and
government mess up again?
It actually gets worse than that.
Oh, gosh.
Because if you think about what's the push that the Democrats have right now, it's for the Green New Deal. It is shifting production away from gas cars to electric cars. So how many billions of dollars have they generated in green company or Green New Deal initiatives? Trillions they have created in the Inflation Reduction Act that Congress passed this year. They created all these Green New Deal subsidies, and even they're calling it the Green New Deal now, when it was the Inflation Reduction Act. So government passes a law that says we want to subsidize electric vehicles. So that creates this big bucket of money that they send to these companies that are working on green technologies. Auto manufacturers are one of them. So when you get funneled a big chunk of government money, all of a sudden, what happens to your profits? Todd, what's your guess?
I'm guessing it goes away because right now that technology is just not viable and consumers aren't interested in it.
Long term, you're right. Short term, your profits go nuts. If the government gives me a big chunk, so for our business, if they say, hey, Jason and Todd, for Freedom from the Press, here's $1 million we're going to give you. We had a really profitable year, regardless of how our core business is doing. Now, that money gets filtered to all these executives because these executives at these auto companies are paid on performance. However much profit the auto company makes is how much their bonus is. So then what happens to the workers? The workers get pissed because they're like, why do all these executives get all this money? Understand the executives got that money because the government gave them money, not because they actually were running a profitable underlying business. So the auto workers right now are pushing for a 32-hour work week and a 40% increase in pay. Never mind the fact that the underlying financials for these companies are horrible and the switch to electric is going bad. We run a bunch of articles on the AmericanTribune.com how nobody's buying EVs. There's all sorts of problems. You can't charge them. So short term, all these executives who said, okay, cool, we'll convert to electric vehicles, they're making a ton of money. The workers are getting screwed because they're seeing that money go to them. But long term, their company is destroyed because they're not going to be able to profitably manufacture and sell electric cars. So what happens in 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Todd, how's that going to end?
If I had my crystal ball to look at, I'd say the government's just going to give them more money again to bail them out because we can't lose GM. God forbid they compete in the free market.
Right.
Jason, can I get sarcastic for a moment then? So what I heard you say was that the government gave these auto manufacturers tons of money, squeezed out the little guy, the hard workers that are actually doing it, and now Joe Biden has the gall to go picket alongside the very auto workers that he screwed over in the first place. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes. And if you watch the news media, they're going to slather over Joe Biden standing with union workers. And let me be honest, the union workers should have got a cut of that money. When they got all that big money from the government, that shouldn't have went to the CEO or the executives. The CEO and executives took it on a contingent. That's how their salary's predicated, where it's predicated on that it's based on annual performance. So if your company makes a bunch of money, your pay goes up, where the workers don't have that deal. But what they don't understand, and what the union should be fighting for, is those executives are ruining their company. They're going to be out of business if they don't fix it, because trying to make these EVs is it's just not going to be profitable. It's just not going to work long term.
Yep. So Roger, you got it. Taxpayers again get screwed. If there's a theme that you haven't picked up yet, it's that you and I get hosed every time these politicians make some corrupt deal.
Yeah, and actually it's important too. Like, one of the most popular narratives are millionaires and billionaires don't pay their fair share. Everybody can pull out a stat. Everybody can say, the top 1% pays this much of taxes, or they paid X percent or not. But let me explain how how the media spins that to just get us mad at whatever. If you want to own a stock and your stock go, and I'll switch back to my friend Jim. I remember it was a number of years ago, bought $10,000 worth of Tesla stock. 3 years later, it was worth like $300,000. Now, if he was a famous person, he had a couple digits to that, they would have said that all of a sudden this guy's worth, his net worth went up 300%. Jim had no cash. What they're proposing is that Jim would have had to sell his stock to pay tax for his capital gain increase. So the point where you pay taxes, and rich people, yeah, they absolutely play this game. Every American should buy stock, buy crypto, invest in property, because you can accumulate that wealth without having to pay tax on it.
And
So
Jason, Donald Trump slammed Hillary to the ground in 2016 when she called him out on not paying taxes. And he said, "This is your system. I'm just smart about it." Right. So
right.
hate these millionaires and billionaires all you want. And sure, you can be envious and jealous, but at the end of the day, they're going to try to keep as much of their money as possible. And that's what all of us should be doing here. No one wants to pay taxes. When Democrats vote for larger government, they're voting for more taxes. And I don't think they quite realize that they are writing a check to the government. And I got to guess your friend Jim wasn't too excited about having to sell stock if unrealized gains became a thing, right?
Yeah, it was funny because, I tend to be pretty conservative when it comes to financials. I believe you diversify, own a lot of different stuff, and everybody can do it. I mean, even if you're growing up, I grew up in a trailer park, dirt poor, man. We didn't have any money, but you could always set some money aside. And you know what? Maybe you buy $100 stock. Maybe you just spend $100 this month and buy a stock. And it doesn't seem like much, but a month from now, 2 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that's where you set up generational wealth. And that's one thing my dad taught me, is how to be smart, how to save money. And I'm going to end up in a lot better shape than my dad. And I hope my kids end up in a lot better shape than me, because I taught them how to invest and build. And it's not super complicated, folks. It doesn't need to be.
But you have to have long-term thinking in place. You have to be willing to set aside $100 of fun, momentary fun right now and say, I'm taking the long road on this, $100 a month, compound interest is my friend, and in 30 years, I'm going to be looking really good.
Absolutely. So, folks, here's our call to actions for you. One, we're going to ask you to like, comment, and share this content. Especially share this with people that maybe you don't politically agree with, that don't understand, the people who are screaming about how, oh, Republicans want to cut our free money, or they want, you see it all in the media right now. Share them with this and say, folks, this is how much money we owe. How does this make any sense? Why do we want to keep digging this hole and make it a bigger hole? It just doesn't make any sense. And I'll also say, for whatever power you have, most people are watching this on some sort of social media platform. Reach out to your local representative and these representatives in Congress who are fighting for sanity. Send them a note. You won't believe, they're sitting there getting their butt kicked and the media's lying about them. Guys like Matt Gaetz, like, you think his life's really good, taking on all this spending and trying to get government to do that? Hell no. But that's why when he sees notes from citizens, when some dude from Idaho sends him a note saying, thank you for what you're doing, that means a lot to him. And folks, there's more of us than there are of them. And even a lot of them that are supporting this crazy spending, they just don't understand what they're supporting, because they don't even understand that we're $33 trillion in debt. So,
or they think it's Donald Trump's fault. And look, Jason and I are not threatening. I don't like to think that we are, right? We're presenting the facts here as we understand them here. We're just trying to go through the debt, help people explain. This is for everybody. We are not partisan. We are freedom from the press. We're trying to break out of that mainstream narrative where it pits left versus right. And don't get us wrong, there are issues right versus left, but the $33 trillion debt is not one of them. That is all of our problem.
Absolutely. Well, folks, if you like what we do, like, comment, share. We'd encourage you to subscribe. We Tribune.com, and we also have our Substack website, which Will Tanner, he just dropped a hot episode this week where he was talking about Jeffrey Epstein and his connections to the intelligence community. Any thoughts on that article, Todd?
Gosh, I feel like we need to leave a cliffhanger. Maybe we talk about that next week a little bit. We're back at 11 o'clock next Friday. We're here every Friday at 11. a.m. Central Time, 12 Eastern here. And so maybe we'll have to do a little exploring into that latest Substack because it is a doozy.
It's a doozy. I don't think we can talk about it on Facebook, though, Todd.
We might have to come up with code words for next week.
Right.
All right. Well, folks, thanks for joining along. Thanks for the comments, the sharing, the liking that's going to take place here. Appreciate you listening to us again today. Have a great weekend.